Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I am delighted to be joined today by Jo Thomas, and we are going to be diving into recovery. What is recovery? Sort of individuals' different interpretations, I suppose, of that, and this topic of recovery perfection. What is that, and how can we get away from it? How can we, recover imperfectly? I don't know. I'm saying words. Jo, welcome today. It's so lovely to have you here. I'm really excited to get stuck in.
Oh, thank you for having me, Jackie. I'm super pleased to be here with you today as well. Just to introduce myself really briefly, I'm Jo Thomas. I'm a fatigue coach. I also have a background in nursing, and I've had my own experience of overcoming chronic fatigue from POTS. And I learned a lot myself during my recovery. And I learned more via my training in NLP coaching, plus what I discovered. I've learned all my life, my career through nursing. And then just also, I've had more insights from coaching people with chronic fatigue related challenges as well. So that's me.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think, what you just said at the end there, as a coach, whether you're a breathing coach or a fatigue coach or whatever sort of a coach, when you're working in this sort of space, we learn from our own experiences, but we do also learn so much from working with others. I always think I learn as much from my clients as they do from me. I don't know if that's true, but I certainly feel like, I do learn something from every single person I work with. And I think that's such a gift of what we do. So I think that's really lovely. So you said that you have had your own personal experience of fatigue and POTS, which is going to be very familiar, I think, to our listeners here, whether it's an exact replica of that or whether that is a part of what they're experiencing. And I'd sort of love to start off by sort of talking a little bit about what helped you, and maybe where that got you to now. And I think that might take us into the next bit.
Okay, so to keep it as short as possible, it was 2017, I became unwell. I was diagnosed relatively quickly, within 3 months, with dysautonomia. Under that umbrella name condition, it was POTS that affected me the most. And I was very lucky to have medical management quite swiftly. I had medication to help slow down the excessive heart rate that's going on with POTS, and that helped alleviate or certainly improve a lot of symptoms such as palpitations, racing heart rate, feeling really dizzy, shortness of breath. But what did persist, despite a lot of that improving, was the chronic fatigue. And it took me a while to realize that this is something that was going to take a while to resolve or certainly improve. And medical management wasn't really going to address this problem. But what was really empowering, once I really joined the dots and realized what was going on, was lifestyle changes, mindset, work, nervous system regulation, all these other practices that I could just get on and implement myself once I knew how, could make a world of difference. And then my recovery, I often say, was in layers. So in the first stage, there was the medical management, and I'm hugely grateful for that. So I'm not a coach that says, my coaching can just help you. It can exist with medical management and other disciplines. And I think I always like to be really honest, different things work for different people. We can't get away from that reality. But for the vast majority of people, mindset shifts, nervous system regulation, pacing yourselves, and other practices such as that can really help you significantly progress in your recovery, even for some people to the point of a full recovery. So, like I said, there was the medical management. And then when there was the chronic fatigue issue that was persisting, mindset shifts and pacing really helped me out. So that was like the next layer. And actually, I got to a point where I was really great and life ticked on quite happily for a while. And then we hit the pandemic. And during the pandemic, I'm a nurse as well. I still nurse 2 days a week. And I was working in a specialist department. I went back to working in ICU for a while, and that was really stressful. I mean, the whole COVID world was stressful to people. It presented a danger and a threat. Um, I was okay actually whilst I was working in ICU, but it's when I went back to the specialist department and started managing it, and just like many, many months had progressed since then, and I think just this low grade chronic stress, I burnt out, and then there was a resurgence of all my symptoms. And then I sort of realized I needed to get back to what I was doing a bit. And actually, I needed to look at some of my deep seated thought patterns because this drive I had to always keep pushing. And I almost had this like, I don't know, because it was the pandemic and we knew it wasn't going to be perfect and there was a lot of demand on the NHS, I just had to keep delivering. I had to keep going. I almost told myself there was no choice. And I could see the signs I was burning out. And I kept thinking my POTS and chronic fatigue might resurge. I carried on and then hit burnout. What was good about that time was I temporarily left my nursing job. I did my NLP coach training. I had a lot of aha insights. There was a lot of deep personal reflection. There was a lot of look at free reflective practice at myself, at my personal drivers, and shifting some of those. So, not only this time to get me back to wellness, to maintain my wellness. So, it was almost like 3 stages my recovery. I'm probably going off on a tangent, but that's essentially what it looked like. And I'm sure I will carry on learning as well.
Yeah, I think certainly something that I found was that, I also kind of did it in layers, not the same layers as you, but you find something that helps and then you sort of plateau. And then you find the next thing and you plateau. And it's that sort of continual search for the next thing, isn't it? And then I got to the point where eventually I was like, yeah, okay, I'm good. I'm recovered. And I was very, very terrified, I think, in fact, to start with, that if I put a foot wrong, I was going to slide back. So I sort of went into this kind of like sort of terrified perfectionist kind of thing, where I was sort of obsessively thinking I've got to keep doing the things that keep me well. So you can tell that one of my drivers is perfectionism. And that was quite an aha moment. And it was almost kind of this realization that life isn't going to be perfect. And that doesn't mean that I'm not recovered. It just means that life happens. And that, maintaining, as you say, that wellness for me was continuing a breath practice. It was not falling into the old patterns that I knew that I easily could, and not sort of working myself to the bone, which is what I'd done previously. And I think, certainly for me, the journey continues. So, I continue to have things that I need to work on, and it's this kind of continual learning, I think, isn't it? That, it's almost for me, once my eyes were opened to what health really meant, I see different ways that I can do better. And that doesn't mean that it was my fault that I wasn't doing them right up until that point. It's almost like you don't know until you know. So I love this kind of idea of sort of continual development, that goes on, and the sort of maintenance of health. And I think that's such a amazing, I don't know if you want to call it a gift or a silver lining or something, to have kind of come out of a really, really awful experience. Because let's be real about it, whether it's your experience, which started before COVID came along and sort of resurged sort of during, or my experience that started with COVID, or, whatever, when you're listening, whatever your experience is, it's absolutely horrendous. But yeah, I think for me, it was that I had to be able to take something positive from that horrendous experience, because otherwise it's sort of too devastating almost. So that was kind of my take on it. But we were sort of wanting to go on to talk about recovery perfection, but you also said something really interesting a moment ago about the sort of mindset shift. And this is one that I think people can, maybe get a little bit on edge about, when we mention mindset, because I think people can interpret it that, oh, you just need to snap out of it, or, just think positive and you'll be fine. And I don't think that is really what we're talking about here, is it? But what are your kind of thoughts on the mindset shift versus you can't think yourself better? Where's the balance in that, or what did you kind of experience?
So I think when it comes to chronic fatigue recovery, there's so many paradoxes, and that's what can make
Mm,
it difficult to navigate. So in those early stages, sort of like that second layer of recovery for me was shifting from, so I don't really want to talk about my symptoms or my story in too much detail because that's not what we're here for. But just to help illustrate this, I had been bitten by a tick and then got sick. So was wondering, have I got Lyme's disease? And I had the testing on the NHS and it came back as negative. But I've been doing some research and they were saying there's far more sensitive tests out there. And, the NHS test can initially come back as negative. So I was doing a lot of research on how can I have a more sensitive test? Is this Lyme's? And that was keeping me kind of stuck in this scenario where I was dependent upon something happening in the future before I could get better. It was keeping me stuck, it was keeping me in limbo. Also, it was driving an underlying fear that, what if this is Lyme's? Where can I be from now? If I'm not getting on with active treatment now, am I going to be so much worse? That kind of dialogue, which, is completely understandable. But I had this realization with time that so much time had passed since that bite anyway, that having like antibiotic treatment, say, for example, as one type of treatment, the time window had probably elapsed. And then I started to think about, well, it dawned on me, I've got chronic fatigue here. And started to think about the patients I had nursed over my career who have various chronic illnesses, but actually seem to do really well despite. And I was thinking, what makes them different? And I was reflecting on conversations I'd had with them. And little did I know they were preparing me for my own health journey, but they just had a different mindset. So rather than thinking of themselves as sick people or ill people, they were people that just had a condition, but they had power in them to put in interventions to help improve their health. They just knew they were going to be okay. They were going to be great despite. It was just very different, and they weren't always just looking at the healthcare professional to say fix them. So I started to reflect upon myself, and I thought, actually, I do know some stuff I can put in place now to help improve my energy levels, such as pacing. I mean, I certainly know a lot more about pacing now. It was very rudimental back then, but it helped. So, you take what you've got. So I started to work on that. And I started to view myself as somebody that was on a journey of wellness. I was somebody recovering. And I also did a few things like, just improve my diet further. I mean, it was pretty good to start with. I took some supplements that helped, that should, promote that they help with energy production. And just all of these things helped. And actually, I think I just stopped being so fearful of what if and just focused on actually, now I can do this, I can do that. And I know I'm going to be fine. And as time went on, that feeling of just knowing I was going to be fine got stronger and stronger. And my energy level started to improve. And just like other symptoms I had started to reduce. So, and with time and continuing with those, I got better. And like I said, I got to a stage where I was pretty great all the time. I mean, maybe I was recovered at that point, but like I said, it was then going into the COVID pandemic, the work-related stress, not taking care of myself at all. I can't think what the word is. I'd almost say I was like a martyr mindset. You've got to get on and sort everybody else out. This is what the name of the game is. And, of course, I fell off my perch again. And there was a resurgence of my symptoms. And then there's probably elements of those three typical characteristics that people talk about with chronic fatigue. So I wouldn't say I was completely these personalities, but you spoke about one, perfectionism, overachieving, people pleasing. So all those things still existed. Then my NLP coach training came in and it helped me with those. Um, and so with mindset, it was thinking of yourself in the wellness, living in wellness, creating wellness, being in a process of recovery, having that belief that you are going to improve or recover, whichever one you want to take upon. But I also know with working with clients, because you said you just can't think yourself better type mindset, is because I do think we have to be taking care of ourselves with restorative rest, other practices, pacing ourselves. But also, I think the mindset you are using at the time has to feel believable to you. So if you're trying on a mindset that doesn't feel believable and you can feel resistance in your body, I think you don't go there. I think your mind, your brain starts to find evidence that it's not true, and it views it as being dangerous. It's this mindset isn't good for you, so I'm going to find lots of evidence that's not true, and actually maybe give you more symptoms. So when I'm working with people, coaching with people, if they have, say, a limiting belief and it's negative and it's holding them back, we look at what the opposite would be to that belief. And I usually call it the antidote. And it's like trying on clothes. We try it on, try that at the moment, hold that thought. And usually I can tell by their nonverbal body language if there's quite a bit of resistance. So we explore that. And I might say, okay, what aspects of that did work for you and what didn't? Can we dial it back a bit? We find something that feels more believable and we take you there as a stepping stone. And I think that helps with nervous system regulation. It helps build the evidence that something is true. It stops so much resistance in the person. And it's not to say that maybe you can think yourself better mindset doesn't work for some people, because we hear about brain retraining and within 2 weeks people do a lot better or they consider themselves fully recovered. And I don't dispute that wasn't the reality for them. But I know for myself and the people I work with, it's usually a gradual process. But saying all that, I do believe we still have to have this hope and this belief that we're going to improve and be better underlying all of it. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I agree about the hope and belief. And I also, I love what you said about it's got to work for you. And I think that is so true about everything, whether it's a diet intervention, whether it is a breathing exercise, doing a breathing exercise that doesn't work for you is not going to help you. You've got to find one that actually works and in a way that works. And it totally makes sense that that works with mindsets and beliefs. So if someone is saying, I can never recover, your antidote to that would be, you can fully recover. And if your person is like, oh gosh, no, that that doesn't feel real to me, then we could look at, okay, well, how can we see some improvement? And okay, we try that one on for size, but that's not to say that that couldn't change over time. When you start seeing improvement, then maybe you do
have that belief of full recovery. But trying to force something onto someone when they're not ready for it is actually going to have the opposite effect, I think. And yeah, that's true of everything. So I think that's a really what's the word? Really wise observation, actually. I think that's really useful. So, for anybody listening, if they're thinking, well, I can't fully recover, okay, but you can see some improvement. Let's do that one first. um, See where we go from there. I love that. And you mentioned the three main sort of drivers or perfectionist traits. Sorry, not perfectionist traits. Oh, what did you call them?
So just character traits that
Character
often
traits.
get cited. So I'm really not one for labels, but often people do bring them up. So overachieving, people pleasing, perfectionism, they're the ones more typically spoken about. And when I work with clients, I don't necessarily bring them up. Actually, I rarely do, but clients will bring them up.
We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops, and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us. Yeah, and I think if you'd have asked me, like, I don't know, 6 years ago, before all of this happened, if I was a perfectionist, I would have said, yeah, I'm a perfectionist. Isn't that a good thing? And I think in some ways maybe it was. It was what made me a good musician. It was what made me diligent at my job. It was, wasn't necessarily a bad thing. But when applied to everything, and certainly when applied to recovery, I think I realized that it was kind of holding me back. And that wasn't that if I suddenly managed to throw away my perfectionist tendencies overnight, which isn't really possible anyway, that I would be recovered the next day. That wasn't true at all. But it was also that this kind of having to do everything perfectly and all that pressure that was putting on myself was holding me back. And that actually, if I was able to do something a little bit, actually that would probably have more benefit than doing it perfectly anyway, whether it was a breathing exercise or pacing or whatever it was that I was trying to do. And I think different people have different of these drivers, and some people have all of them. I'm going to put my hand up to that one. Definitely an overachiever, definitely a perfectionist, and definitely a people pleaser. I definitely tick all of those boxes, and I feel myself falling into some of those patterns sometimes. And I actually said no to something earlier in this week. I said no to something that I didn't want to do, and I would never have done that before. So I want to celebrate that because that's quite a big thing for me. And yeah, so bringing this back to kind of recovery and or improvement, or whatever we want to call this, like, how do we get over this? Because of course we want our life back. Of course we want to be able to do all of the things that we want to do. How do we do that whilst also accepting that life isn't and never will be perfect? Even if you are fully recovered, life is still not going to be perfect. You know, like, what gives?
So yes, and I just wanted to add in, I mentioned those three character traits. I don't view them as black or white, right or wrong. There's many wonderful characteristics to each one. And when I'm working with somebody, we're looking at actually what serves you well from that and what isn't serving you so well, maybe doesn't need applying to every aspect. If we use your example, Well, actually, no, something that frequently can come up when I'm working with clients is, say I'm working with somebody, they're pacing themselves really well, they've got some stability of their energy levels, but they are full of fear of increasing their activity level from due to fear of symptoms, and then feeling they're not doing it perfectly if they get it wrong because they get symptoms, and also that they feel it's going to be their fault that they get the symptoms. We do some reframing, and it can look slightly different for everybody. But just to give you maybe a typical response that can help, a reframing exercise, is looking at where we place our responsibilities and our sphere of control. So we look at the fact that the environment looks good to try pacing up, increasing our activity level, because we've got some stability over our energy levels and less symptoms. And some people will pace up with some mild symptoms that they decided to tolerate. Some people wait to have no symptoms. So, like I said, it's very individualized and everybody's recovery can look different. But it's their responsibility to help aid their recovery by attempting the next stage of pacing up. Then they wait to see how their body responds. It is not their responsibility how the body responds. They don't know what the outcome's going to be. It's like engaging a conversation in yourself, but between yourself and maybe whatever term you want to use, your brain, your mind, your nervous system. So I'm going to start the conversation with I'm going to use the word brain. I'm going to start this conversation with my brain by testing the waters, by increasing my activity level. My brain is then going to give me a response. It might give me just some mild symptoms that disappears after a while. It may give me quite a lot of symptoms that actually really are limiting me right now, and it doesn't feel okay. So that can be two sort of potential outcomes. What my responsibility again is just to respond appropriately. Make a call and respond appropriately. It's not your responsibility, the symptoms you get. So once they repeat, a lot of my clients have that shift, I call it testing the waters. They feel much braver about it and less fearful of the outcome. And it gets away from this idea that you're to blame if you have more symptoms, because you're not. And it helps to get away from this idea of recovery need to be perfect, that every time I try something new, it should just go in a linear fashion. It often doesn't. We can often have setbacks and we get learning from them and then we move forward again. Sometimes the environment can look like it's the right time to increase our activity level, but actually what we needed was just a longer period of consolidation or stability, and then we go again maybe in a week or two's time, whatever the time frame might be. So that can really help. And then just looking at where our focus is. So say if you're looking at recovery in terms of recovery perfection, that every few weeks you're going to increase your activity level and you're going to be successful and then you're going to carry on progressing. It's a reframe that actually recovery probably won't look like that all the time. And maybe the concept of good enough, or the fact that when you're approaching your recovery, it's about trying to think of the best terms of words here. It's about responding appropriately to what comes along. What happens to life throws curveballs too. It's responding appropriately. That's doing a good recovery. Is responding appropriately. And if you need to rest more or take a step back for a moment in time, that is a good recovery because you're responding appropriately. So I think that can help. And then sometimes just looking at where people also place their focus in terms of I should be doing all of this physical stuff right now, but also looking at a shift in focus that has a bigger perspective, looking at actually I'm going to get much better at or be good at the resting stage. I'm going to be good at these practices and stuff. And like I said, because I work with people one-to-one, it becomes apparent when I'm working with them what we need to adjust, what we need to reframe, what is the mindset we need to look at. And sometimes we need to take the focus off the need to be fully recovered, because it can put a pressure upon ourselves, which we can be aware of consciously and subconsciously. And when we shift the focus to looking at what we're doing now instead, somehow it helps people progress forward.
We'll be right back. Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much.
Yeah, because I think certainly what I discovered, and I see this in people as well, is that, you start doing better. And things start improving. You find things that help. You are able to do more things, enjoy life a little bit more, and that's wonderful when that happens. But then that, I think, for me was where the perfectionist really started kind of kicking in, because it was like, right, things felt fragile because, we all know that you get an up and it's always followed by a down, because we've experienced it however many times before. So it's almost like, you're upswinging and you're so scared of, quote unquote, making a mistake that is going to cause you to downswing, that actually you sort of, certainly for me, I got really scared of doing more things. I got, very sort of having to do everything perfectly, and that sort of almost in hindsight kind of immobilized me, and probably held me back, whereas maybe if I'd sort of swung a bit more freely, I wouldn't have kind of got into that kind of sort of perfectionism thing. Whereas actually, in hindsight, maybe what I should have done is to have just really enjoyed the fact that I was able to do more things, and really kind of got stuck into how amazing it was that I could do whatever it was that I couldn't do before, and enjoy that. And I think, yeah, people do often get so hung up, I think, on the full recovery, that there's that pressure, making them actually, like, that's actually kind of holding them back from that. And that's such a difficult one. You mentioned earlier that there's so many paradoxes here, and I feel like this is almost another one, that you're so close you can almost touch it, and it's the fact that you're focusing on that that's stopping you from actually getting there and stepping over the finish line. And I don't know. I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it? Maybe this is where your point about, letting go of that desperation for full recovery, and actually just leaning into the stuff that you are able to do at that point, that maybe you subconsciously drift over the line without even noticing. And I don't know, I get the impression that's sort of where you're floating around at the moment in your own journey.
Yes, so a long time I've described myself as being sort of 95% recovered. But Jackie and I chatted a little bit before we jumped on recording this podcast, and we spoke about this briefly. And it was when I was filling in the information for this podcast interview, and I was typing again, I consider myself 95% recovered. I thought, you know what, I cannot even remember when I last had any fatigue or POTS related symptoms. It's at least a year. Maybe it's a lot longer. Maybe I'm getting to the 2-year line benchmark. So maybe I am fully recovered. But what I was also saying to Jackie is it doesn't bother me. It's just like not something I think about, because things are great. And if I should get a few little symptoms, I know they're just going to be a few little symptoms telling me that something is out of sync in my life. Maybe there's a stressful event going on that I'm trying to block out or plow on through slightly. Maybe I've got a virus brewing that I'm unaware of. So it it just notifies me that I just need to check in, reflect on what's going in, and see if anything's out of balance and if that needs addressing. So to me, I'm probably am fully recovered, or maybe I'm 95% recovered. But the fact I know that this is how my body communicates with me is not an issue. It's almost irrelevant what that final line is. Um, but what we don't, what so getting a few symptoms helps keep me in check, which is brilliant. But what we don't want to be is fearful of those symptoms because then they start to override again. So it's just a way I know now that my body communicates with me by giving me very, very mild, subtle physical symptoms. I check in on what's going on and do what's required. And when I talk about living life in balance, balance is definitely a constant shifting sort of landmark as such. So I have a family, I have young kids, and my priority is family time over work. But sometimes work has to be the priority over family time. Or unexpected things crop up and they change what's going on. So we might have to shift around. So this idea of like a perfect work-life balance or whatever balance it is you're looking for is constantly changing. But it's knowing how to navigate that and keep moving with it and being flexible with it. So, yes, and I do know myself for that final stage of recovery, not being focused on the need to be fully recovered just shifted me along. And I think that was because I was focused on what I could do, but also in that, I think it's really regulating for the nervous system, being very present in the moment. It's, you're letting your nervous system know that this feels really safe, everything's good, and I've got this. But that's what
Yeah.
worked for me, and I see it work for others.
Yeah, and I think, I find this really interesting because I think through a condition like this, part of the healing journey or the journey of recovery or whatever you want to call it is this greater awareness. So, how much of the stuff that I now notice, when I get stressed, I feel it in my body and I go, oh, I'm noticing that. That must have happened before. I just ignored the hell out of it because I didn't have that awareness. And even if I did, I didn't have time for that. So, I would have ignored anything that I even had noticed. So I think, the greater awareness is a gift, but it also is something that I think we have to learn to understand. But, I think one thing that I also found really helpful when I was starting to sort of see a lot of improvement. So I'd done the downswing where I was doing less and less and less and less and still feeling worse and worse and worse. And then I'd done the bit where I found a load of things that helped and I'd done my sort of gentle sort of, stepping up plateau, step up plateau and that sort of thing. And, it was as I was sort of I suppose in hindsight, more on the sort of final upswing, although I didn't know that at the time. I was having to ask myself, what is normal? What is a normal response? And, it's hard to answer that question because, you're a very different person after going through something like this. For me, I would say I'm a much better person, but you're certainly a very different person. So what is normal? Well, normal is shifted. Um, but it's kind of like, if I increase my activity, say I walk for 6 minutes instead of 5 or 7 minutes instead of 5, you know, I would expect to feel tired after that because I've increased my activity. Now, I would expect to feel a bit tired. I wouldn't expect to be in my bed for 2 weeks. So it's coming back to what is a normal reaction to having increased your activity by, I'm trying to do maths here, almost 50%. It's like if you were an athlete, say you ran 5Ks twice a week, and then suddenly you step up and you do a 10K, you're going to notice that because you've doubled it. So, putting that back into the context of long COVID or MECFS or POT, so, it's yeah, it's that what is normal kind of thing, isn't it? And I think as we start to come out of these things, our body does start to react more normally. And if we can kind of say to ourselves, okay, this is a normal reaction, then we don't suddenly go into that complete panic cycle that we can get into because, oh my goodness, my heart rate's gone up, you know. And then, we can get incredibly activated by that happening. Whereas if we go, oh, my heart rate went up, well, that's because I went up the stairs or I did some walking or I did whatever. Oh, okay, you would expect that to happen. Then you can sort of I don't know if justify to yourself is the right word, but there's safety in knowing that it's normal, isn't there? I think, and knowing that this is what's supposed to happen, rather than this is an abnormal reaction. Therefore, my body isn't functioning right. Therefore, I have quote unquote done it wrong, which isn't even the right way to think about it, even if that was the case. Um,
Yeah, I fully agree. So it's remembering what is normal. So, say for
yeah.
example, somebody's pacing themselves, and then one day they felt fine, and then the next 2 days they didn't feel quite so energized, and they felt a bit more tired at the end of the day. And I'm not talking about somebody that's having, PEM or energy crashes. They might start to think like, oh no, why do I not feel quite so energized today? And why do I feel ready for bed half an hour before bedtime, whatever their normal bedtime is? And it's like thinking back to before you became sick, that's what it was like. Some days you'd be a bit more tired than others, particularly if you did a little bit more. And I think we can forget what normal is. I'm not suggesting for one moment having chronic fatigue is just being tired. I'm not at all. It's completely different. It's like a completely heavy bodied, can hardly move this body experience of tiredness, and you wake up unrefreshed. It's completely different. But like you were saying, it's also remembering that after you've done a bit more, it is normal to feel tired. And I think sometimes we can forget that slightly when we're on the recovery journey, and we can over analyze some of the details too much. And some of it just has to be accepted. And I know for myself, our brain can play tricks upon us, because when I think about where I am now and how much I can do, and it is a lot, where my brain will go for a point of comparison is to how I was in my 20s. I'm in my 40s now, and it will want to use my 20-year-old self as a point of reference, which isn't realistic at all. And, in my 20s, I didn't have two daughters, I didn't have a dog, I wasn't doing two jobs, and I was younger and I had a lot more time to rest up as well. So it's just sometimes watching what you're using for a point of comparison, and just some remembering what is normal tiredness, or you've increased your activity level. Yes, you're going to feel it in your body a little bit more. And sometimes it's bringing that back in, because when we're going through our journeys with recovery, with chronic fatigue, everything can become very worrying. Every little subtle change can become very worrying. And that feeds into the fear, and that can keep us stuck, and it can dysregulate our nervous system. And just to have a healthy point of reference that, this is really mild. I would have got this before I was sick. And it is worth remembering that.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I did certainly to start with was I over glorified my previous life. So, I wanted nothing more than to get back to the perfect life that I was living before. I would have given absolutely anything in the world to have my perfect life back. And then, part of my kind of recovery process was kind of realizing that I didn't live a perfect life. I sort of feel like I do now. I feel like I'm incredibly lucky that I now do kind of live that perfect life. But, I mean, it's not perfect at all. But it feels good. It feels good in my body. It feels authentic. Whereas the life I was living before, was constant stress. I was doing a job I didn't love. I was overworking. I was over exercising. I was over everythinging. Whereas now I have this sort of increased awareness and much greater, I suppose, gratitude for everything, appreciation of everything. So, it's kind of like you said about your point of reference. There's a time frame thing there, because as you say, in your 40s, you're very different to your 20s in terms of your energy and your perspective and what you want from life, I suppose. But also, yeah, not falling into that trap of wanting something that actually maybe we don't want, and kind of, what is it that's important to you, and how can we go about looking for that? I think, certainly that was my experience. But, it took me some time to kind of come to that realization, I suppose. I fought against it a lot. I think some things do take time, and also it's very personal. I think.
Yeah, I fully agree. And, my life looks different to what it was before I had the POTS and the chronic fatigue. And it is better for it. And I live my life much more in alignment with my values and beliefs. I say no to things that I should say no to now that I wouldn't have done before. Absolutely. Congratulations to you earlier for saying no earlier this week. And when you listen to people who talk about recovery stories, they are now often living life slightly differently so they can maintain their wellness. So, and I know myself, like I said, it was 2017 that I was diagnosed dysautonomia POTS. It was following being bitten by a tick. At the time, I thought it came out from nowhere and it just, shook my world. And it was a crash when it happened. But when I look back, I think I had symptoms of POTS during my second pregnancy, but they were super mild and infrequent. And I just put them down to being tired because I was pregnant and blood pressure changes. But when I really, really looked back and reflected, once I was able to, my life was too busy. It was too stressful. I was trying to do too much all the time. I was burning myself out low grade all the time. I wasn't keeping myself in wellness. And my body knew this. And this is what I feel now. My body knew this. The tick didn't cause the problems. It was just the tipping point. And it was just that tipping point to put some more fear in me on top of all that chronic stress. And my body said, no, we need to stop now. And you're not listening to me because those warning signs that I listen to now, I'm sure they existed before. But like you said, I didn't deliberately choose to ignore them. I just did because that's how I lived my life. And almost that's how we're brought up to react. And then just crashed and had to learn my lessons the hard way. But I have done now. So there we go.
Yes, and I love that phrase that you've used a couple of times now, keeping yourself in wellness. And I think, this was something that I learned, not that I valued money above everything else or that I valued status above everything else. But now I value health and the freedom that that gives you above everything else, above work, above money, above what people think of me. And I think, if you want to say that there's a gift to come from all of this, for me, I would say it's that, that health is the most precious thing that we have. And, maintaining it, keeping yourself in that health, in that wellness has got to be the most important thing. And I think I've truly learned that as you say the hard way. But I think it's a lesson that will serve me, going forward. Um, Jo, thank you so much for coming along today. This has been so much fun. I think we hit record not really knowing exactly where we were going to go, and I think it's been fascinating for me. I think it's been really useful for people listening as well. And I will make sure that I put links in the show notes so people can get in touch with you if they would like to. So thank you so much.
Oh, no, thank you, Jackie. It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of my guests and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch